my name is Michellanne Li. Y'all can also call me Mish. And today I'm going to be speaking to you about designing accessible sign-up forms. So I know that not everyone reads the bios on the MidCamp website, so you might be wondering, who is this chick? I'm a designer, a developer, and an accessibility crusader. Here I've inserted myself into a scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So my husband lost his leg in a motorcycle accident, and he uses a prosthetic. Here's a photo of him, his prosthetic. And accessibility is something that we always factor in when we're making travel plans. So recently we were planning a trip with friends who have children. And so I visited a travel website that specializes in kid-friendly property rentals. And it's aimed at families, and it offers global destinations, so it's safe to assume that they have a global audience. So I get to the homepage, and here it is. And at first I was pretty excited, it's very fun, it's colorful, and it's been featured on some very trendy lifestyle blogs. It's like, okay, that's a good sign. However, as I started using it, especially when I began to sign up for the service, I began to notice some really glaring accessibility issues. And so I thought it would be an interesting exercise to redesign the user flow of signing up. And to be clear, this company has no idea who I am, and they didn't pay me for this. They don't know about this presentation, but I really believe that we designers can have an outsized impact on users with disabilities by focusing on really common design patterns, such as signing up for a service. So let's talk about what is not accessible on this website. So for starters, none of the links have a focus state. They've actually disabled the default focus state, which is really bad practice. It would be really nice if there was a skip to main link so that users who are navigating the site with a tab key could skip over the navigation and not have to tab through the entire thing every time they load a page. So you click on the sign up link in the main nav and you get this pop-up window here. And at the top there's a button that says sign up with Facebook, and below that there's a form to sign up with email, and below that there's a link to log in if you already have an account. So what this means is that if you're a user who already has an account, you have to tab through the sign up with Facebook button and this entire form to get to that login link, and that's a lot of tabbing. Also, the text contrast is way too low. I could barely see it with my glasses on. And so the text on the right side of the form, that's actually labels. It says first name and last name. So those are labels, but the text on the left, the 7+ characters and optional, that's placeholder text. So that means it disappears when the user starts typing. So let's say you're a user with a cognitive disability, like poor short-term memory, or maybe you have a migraine, or maybe you're just busy and distracted. And you start to type in your password, and as you're typing, you forget that it needs to be 7 or more characters. So maybe you enter like a 6-character password. When you do that, you're taken to this page. And at the top of the page, there's another sign up with Facebook button. And then below that, it says oops, and you see the errors are listed, and then the field in question has been highlighted. So this is a really strange placement for the sign up with Facebook button. It really doesn't need this much hierarchy. It's nice to offer it as an option. Still, if signing up with Facebook is easier, but a screen reader is going to read that first, and that's not really the point of this page. I do like that the header one that says oops makes the intent of this page really clear. When you read that, you know that something went wrong. It would also be nice if the title tag in the markup, in the head of the markup, reflected that there are errors on this page. It could say something like 2 errors, or it could even say oops or something. So an assistive technology device would read that title tag, and also, sighted users who are, looking at their browser tabs would be able to see that in that little browser tab at the top. I do like that the errors are listed at the top, so you see them right away. We're not obscuring them. That's nice. It would be better if the container that the messages are in was programmatically focusable. So that way that you could actually tab to it and navigate to that container. And the way you do that is you give it a tab index of -1. It'd also be great if the error is linked to their related input. On a form this short, it's really not a big deal to navigate down to that input, but if this was a very long form, that could be a lot of labor and a lot of cognitive load. And the error text contrast, this red on pink, is way too low. All right, so let's say you get that form submitted, then you're taken back to the home page. And now there's this blue bar at the top and it tells you to like update your profile. It's really not clear at this point whether you've successfully signed up for the service. You know, this blue bar is very easy to overlook because it blends in so well with the design, and the text contrast for that content in the blue bar is way too low, so you're unlikely to notice it at all. So this is kind of like that metaphor in the accessibility community of taking someone out on a date and leaving them in the field. You don't know how you got here or where to go. All right, so let's take a look at my redesign. All right, so starting with the home page, I didn't really dig into the entire home page, but I added a skip to main link. All right, and then when you click the sign up link in the main navigation and you get this pop-up window, there's a button to sign up with Facebook, there's a button to sign up with email, and there's a link to log in if you already have an account. So here we have really 3 options you can tap through, which means that a user doesn't have to tab more than 3 times to get to the one that's right for them. I want to note a couple things in the markup. So these buttons, the icons within the buttons, this Facebook icon and the little envelope for sign up with email, these have an ARIA hidden attribute. They really don't add to the content of the buttons because the text makes it really clear, you know, what their intent is. And so it's not necessary for screen readers or assistive technologies to understand those icons. And there's X at the top right. So we see an X and we understand intuitively that, you know, that means you're going to close the window, right? But assistive technology can't pick up on those visual cues. So it's an SVG file and it has a title attribute as well as some hidden text that says, you know, close window, in order to provide some extra information to assistive technologies. All right, so let's say you click on the button that says sign up with email. Then you're taken to this page. It's create your account, and we have a form to sign up. So for starters, the elements have a focus state. So this first form field is in focus state. You can see that it's got a yellow highlight around it. It's a little hard to see over the on the projector, but there's a drop shadow on this field, and it's a little bit lighter. So there's a number of visual differences that make it stand out as being in focus state. Other things to note, so the required fields have asterisks, so we have a visual indicator that they're required. They also have a required attribute in the markup and some visually hidden text saying this, you know, this field is required. And if you're wondering, like, you know, why do we have, you know, both the required attribute and the visually hidden text like this, it seems like a lot. Different types of assistive technologies work differently, so we just want to make sure we're addressing all of them. All right, and also, all the form fields have labels. And just to be clear, the text in the middle of the field is actually label, it's not placeholder text. So labels are great because, well, for starters, they tell you what type of information is being asked for. So they have that very practical purpose. Labels also increase the hit area of a form field. So if a user taps or clicks on the label instead of the field, they'll actually select the entire form field. And this is great for users with motor impairments or just, you know, some of us who are a little less coordinated. Top align labels or vertically aligned labels as opposed to horizontally aligned labels that could be on the left or right. So top align labels reduce form completion time because they require only a single eye fixation to take in both the label and the field. You can really just see it all at a glance. And so that actually reduces the completion time for your entire form. I want to note that the design pattern I chose of having this label text within the field, and it gets a little smaller when you click on it and make some space for you to type. This design pattern is pretty controversial, and you could argue that a user might see a form field with this label and think that, you know, that value's already been provided. They don't need to fill it out, or maybe they'll think it's placeholder text. It could be a little deceiving. However, it's a pattern that you see in Google's material design system and also on the Apple website, so I think it's becoming more and more common, and this is definitely the kind of thing you would want to test out with users to confirm if it's confusing or not. I think that we can try new things as designers and, you know, advance design on the web and still make sure that we're always looking to our users and making sure that it's really serving them. All right, so moving down the form to the password field. So I was thinking about passwords, and we forget our passwords a lot, and sometimes we misenter them. We're in the middle of typing and we get distracted, or maybe we have a cognitive disability like ADHD, and we can't remember, you know, how many characters we've typed, you know, or maybe we have a motor impairment and it's hard to tap the correct keys. So I thought it would be really useful for the user to have the option of showing the password. So there's a button on the right side of the password field and it says show, and when you click it, you can see the password, and it changes to hide, and you can click hide, and then your password will be hidden if you have a privacy concern. All right, and then all of these form elements meet WCAG 2.1 contrast requirements. So WCAG 2.0 specified color contrast requirements for text, and that was kind of a loophole because you could have other, you know, parts of your interface that are really essential to understanding the design, and they could have really low contrast and still technically meet WCAG 2.0. So WCAG 2.1 introduced a new requirement for non-text content, such as these form fields, and specified the contrast requirements for that. So, you know, it's really important that you can see these in order to interact with this page, and so we want to make sure that they're covered as well. All right, so let's talk about this date input below. So here we have a question: you must be 18 years old or older to sign up. Please verify your birthday. And this is a really common question in similar competitor websites to ask users to verify their age before they can sign up for the service. And I was doing some competitive analysis, so I thought, well, it would be good to include this question while we're redesigning this whole experience. And that got me thinking about date inputs. You know, date formats, they're not universal. My husband grew up in Europe, and so he uses European date formats, which go day, month, year. And I grew up here in the US, and so I use the date format month, day, year. And for this reason, I have forgotten his birthday a lot of times. And our anniversaries, and many other important dates. So, I wanted to make date input really unambiguous, make it really clear, you know, exactly how the user needed to fill out this portion of the form in order to answer it, you know, quote unquote, correctly. Because that's, I mean, it could be correct in the sense that they filled it out, but it could be the wrong date for their birthday, and then they wouldn't be eligible for the service. So, so I was thinking, okay, what's the right way to ask for date input to maximize, you know, the accuracy of the information that you're receiving? So my first thought was, okay, we'll use a calendar date picker, because you can see the calendar and it's really unambiguous what day you're picking, and calendars are pretty universal. But actually, according to Nielsen Norman Group, they're really best when you're asking for a range of dates. And they're also the most user-friendly when you're asking for dates that are really close to the present time. And a birthday could be any time of year. Okay, so calendar date picker's out. So then I thought, all right, how about a select input? So user, they might not even see the label, maybe they're not paying attention, but they would click that drop-down arrow and they would see a limited list of options, and it would make it really clear what they were selecting. If it was the months, they could be spelled out. If it was the days of the month or the year, etc. However, select inputs increase interaction costs, because they're adding a lot of clicking and scrolling, and so okay, select inputs were out. However, Adam Silver in his book Form Design Patterns, Nielsen Norman Group, and the UK government, which is really big on accessibility, all recommend asking the user to provide dates through text input. 3 fields for month, day, and year. This is the simplest, most straightforward option. So of course that was the right one. And furthermore, even if you have some other method of asking the user to specify a date, like a calendar date picker, it's really best practice to let the user provide it via text input in addition to whatever widget that you have in place. So DQ has a great accessible calendar date picker, but they also allow for text input, and that's part of that design pattern that they've created. And I link to that at the end of this presentation, by the way. Okay, cool, we've got text input. And the UK government in their accessibility documentation take it a step further, and they recommend that you add the autocomplete attribute to text inputs for things like birthdays that the user might have entered into their browser in the past, so that it autocompletes and we're making it a bit of a smoother experience. So, okay, cool, this is all great. But I didn't want to leave it alone because I was thinking, what about when you're not asking for birthdays? What if you're asking for information that the user probably hasn't typed into their browser before? How would you address that? And, my first thought was, I could use chosen.js. That's like great plugin. It's very pretty. It's definitely an industry favorite. So I went to the chosen.js GitHub repo, and I took a look at their issues to see if anyone had logged issues about accessibility and how that had been handled, because they didn't have any accessibility documentation, which was already a red flag. And once I looked at the issues section, I realized that for the people who've created Chosen, accessibility is kind of an afterthought. It's definitely not a thing they're prioritizing. So I didn't want to use that, but there are a lot of options out in the wild, and I've linked to them at the end of this presentation. You should definitely take a look. I reached out to the Web Accessibility Initiatives interest group. It's an email list. It's just a group of wonderful people who are very excited and interested in accessibility. And I said, hey guys, what are some accessible autocomplete plugins or autocompletes that exist in the world? And I got some really great feedback. So definitely take a look at that. If you decide to create your own autocomplete, you're going to code it all up from scratch yourself, that's definitely an option. A few things to note about that. So for your list of options, predetermined options, you want to wrap that in a UL tag. So HTML5 also has a data list element. It was specifically created for autocomplete. So you'd think that would be the right answer, but it's not compatible with Safari or IE9. So until it is, that one's out. All right, you also want to use the ARIA attribute role equals combo box. So that's the attribute that will describe to assistive technologies what is happening here. And you want to make sure that your list of options are navigable by keyboard. So creating this, requires a fair amount of JavaScript, but depending on your user flow, it might be worth it to, invest that time into building out that interface. Some of you might be wondering, how about just having the user check a box to verify that they're 18 years old or older? Wouldn't that be simpler? So for starters, that's not as fun, right? But also, there could be a business reason to want to gather demographic data about your users. So there might be times when you do want to collect their birth date. All right, so as you're filling out your form, you want to get some feedback to know if you're doing it right. And I'm not a huge fan of the traditional design pattern in which you fill out a form, you go through all the fields, and maybe you have to look stuff up or think about it. And then you hit submit, and it takes you to a new page, and maybe you have some errors, so you have to go back and think about what you did wrong, and it's a lot of cognitive load and extra steps. So I was thinking it would be really nice to have some inline dynamic validation that would tell the user whether or not they correctly filled out each field as they go. So I did some research into that just to confirm whether that was a great idea or not. And the London-based usability firm Etra, in partnership with Luke Wroblewski, he's the author of the book Web for Design, highly recommend, also linked to at the end of this presentation. They did a study in which they compared forms with inline dynamic validation with the more traditional design pattern of hitting submit and then seeing errors. And they found that those with inline validation were easier to fill out. Participants completed them more quickly. They were less error prone. There was a higher success rate and a higher rate of satisfaction among users. There was a 22% greater success rate, a 22% decrease in errors, and a 42% decrease in completion time. So that's pretty significant. It's worth noting that this approach works best when you're asking for information that's not self-evident to the user, like their name or their zip code. So in that way, this form might not be the ideal use case. And inline validation may also be kind of annoying to some users, because it's appearing as they're typing. So it's possible that it would make more sense for a longer form or a more complex form, and you would again definitely want to user test this. A few things to note about how this is built. So if a field is filled out incorrectly, you want to add an ARIA invalid attribute to flag that there is some kind of issue to assistive technologies. Because there's new information appearing on the page as you go, you could employ Drupal RL alerts to notify assistive technologies that there's some new information on the page. Right, we have these icons on the left. There are checks next to the correct fields and X's next to the incorrectly completed fields. These icons they're pretty large, they're very clear, they meet minimum contrast requirements for non-text content that we talked about earlier. And even though they're red and green, which is not great for users who are colorblind, they're distinct enough from one another that hopefully there won't be any confusion. And the errors that appear in line are directly above the fields that they relate to, and they're wrapped in a label tag so that they're associated with those fields when assistive technology is parsing the page. All right, so you fill out the form, you get it successfully submitted, and you're taken to this page. And it says success. So, all right, you know that you've had success. You can feel pretty confident that you've submitted the form. And there's some options for moving forward. There's a link to update your profile, or you can start browsing home. So users know that they've signed up and they have next steps and a really clear path forward. Going back to that metaphor about taking someone out on a date, we're not leaving them in a field, we're walking them to their doorstep. All right, so all of these examples that I showed you, these are best practices and they're all backed by research, but you absolutely want to be testing your work with users with disabilities. That is hands down the best way to validate if it's truly accessible. And here's a list of resources. I've uploaded my slides to the MidCamp website, so recommend you take a look at them. And I'm going to open the floor up for questions. Yes?
I noticed that there wasn't a password verification. Do you have any thoughts about that?
You mean like re-entering your password to... Yeah, I looked into that, and a lot of people feel that asking the user to enter their password twice is kind of a blocker. It's asking them to take another step. I believe there's been some research into how users respond to it, and it does result in higher abandonment rates. I think showing the password is nice because that way they can double check to confirm whether they've entered it correctly. Yes?
I noticed on the month that you had both the number and the name of the month. Was that to anticipate, like, if the person didn't know, like whether to put in the number or start spelling the month?
Yes, exactly.
Are there any auditing tools that you recommend, knowing users with disabilities?
Yeah, so sorry, did you say, are there any auditing tools?
Yes.
Oh yeah, there's so many good ones out there. I will start by saying that an auditing tool doesn't replace having a real user test it, but it can be a really good first step to catch all the low-hanging fruit. So DQ is excellent. And they created AxeCore, which is like a library of accessibility guidelines. Google uses it, so if it's good enough for Google, it's probably good enough for the rest of us. And it's actually been integrated into Chrome's accessibility feature, so that's pretty nice. So there's some like different tools built off of AxeCore, but DQ also has like their own testing tools. So those are great. I also like Site Improve, and they have some free browser plugins that are really useful. You could also sign up for their service, and that does a more comprehensive site scan, whereas their browser plugins are really just for scanning individual pages. What else? Oh goodness, Paciello Group has a lot of testing tools, Accessibility Sheriff, and there's so many browser plugins out in the wild. Like Wave is a great one. So I would recommend starting with those. There's also some great guides for manual testing. I think the Web Accessibility, the WAI Web Accessibility Initiative website has some resources for learning how to do your own manual testing, and those can help you catch a lot of issues, even if you're not able to do testing with users with disabilities, which is ideal, but not always possible.
I'll ask a question just to fill the void here. You were specifically focusing on forms in your presentation, but in your example site, they're not using any visual indicators for links in terms of color or underlining, and I just get your 2 cents on that.
That drives me crazy.
Yeah.
It's really bad practice. There are times when it's considered unnecessary to provide visual indicators, but those are only for things like a navigation, where someone will look at a navigation at the top of the page and assume those are links, but you should still have a visual indicator for like focus and hover state. But yeah, a lot of websites, the links will only be distinguishable by color, and maybe the color doesn't even contrast very much with the content around it, and it's pretty problematic, especially because it's so easy to resolve. I mean, the very least you could underline the link, and I know some people hate underlining links and thinks it looks ugly, but there's some great CSS solutions for creating more elegant or more interesting underlines. You could have a background color, it could be bold, it could, move a little when you hover over it. I think there's really no good reason not to address that, but a lot of people just choose not to. Yes?
If you're relying on focus and cover to let people know that it's clickable and you don't like the underlines, how does that translate for mobile phones?
Yeah, so mobile phones won't have the hover state, but they'll still have the focus/active state. And so that's a good question, because sometimes you create this beautiful hover state and then you realize it won't work on your mobile device, and what a bummer.
So is that still considered to be accessible then, if it's got the focus on the mobile?
Yes. Yeah. So for accessibility, it's really important not to assume you know exactly what devices your users are engaging with, so that's why you'd still want to have focus state for mobile.
We're at time anyways.
Right.
Thank you.